Millionaire CEO said, "I want freedom, not babies." 2 years later, he regretted everything. Rain slid slowly down the towering windows of the restaurant, tracing silver paths over the glowing Seattle skyline. Inside, soft jazz hummed beneath conversations layered with ambition and celebration. Crystal glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and a long table filled with investors and journalists leaned toward the man at the center of it all, Edgardo Wintheiser. He looked perfectly at ease in the attention. Dark suit, steady posture, a calm smile that never rushed. Hayes Dynamics had just secured another milestone, turning him into one of the youngest millionaire CEOs in the tech world. And tonight, everyone wanted a piece of him. A quote, a handshake, a moment of proximity to success. Across the room, Shannon Viam watched him with a quiet warmth that didn't compete with the spotlight. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as someone raised a toast. "To freedom," a guest joked, lifting a glass. "And maybe one day to a little air running around the office?" Laughter rippled across the table, light and expectant. Outside, rain tapped harder against the glass, like a steady heartbeat keeping time with the evening. Edgardo's expression sharpened just slightly, not annoyed, not amused, simply certain. He lifted his glass. "I worked too hard for my freedom," he said, voice clear enough to hush the room. "I don't want babies. I want a life that's mine." The laughter that followed felt unsure, almost hesitant, like people didn't know whether to celebrate or stay quiet. Shannon's fingers slipped from his sleeve. She lowered her gaze, her smile still present but thinner than before, as if she had stepped half a pace back from a place she thought she belonged. For a second, no one spoke. A journalist scribbled something quickly. Someone cleared their throat. The skyline beyond the glass shimmered, city lights reflecting in droplets of rain that drifted slowly downward. Edgardo didn't notice the shift. He rarely noticed things that didn't align neatly with his plans. He turned slightly, acknowledging a congratulatory pat on the shoulder. "Come on," he added lightly, as though smoothing over the tension. "There's still too much to build." Another round of glasses lifted. Across the table, Shannon reached for her phone, pretending to read a message that didn't exist. Her eyes stayed fixed on the glowing screen, but her breathing changed. Slower, quieter, careful. Moments earlier, she had been laughing beside him. Now she felt like a visitor observing someone else's life. Near the back, a young employee whispered to a colleague, "He's intense." "He always has been," the colleague replied. Edgardo's confidence filled the room, yet an invisible line had been drawn, one that only Shannon seemed to notice. You ever hear someone say something so certain it changes the atmosphere instantly? Maybe you've been at a table where ambition and love sat side by side, and one of them had to move first. Tonight wasn't just a celebration. It was a decision spoken out loud. If you're new here, welcome to Mr. Williams' Storytime, a place where moments like this become journeys worth thinking about. And if you enjoy stories that explore real choices and real growth, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Back at the table, Edgardo leaned toward an investor discussing expansion plans. Numbers and opportunities filled his world, feelings rarely interrupted. Shannon watched him from a distance that felt longer than the length of the room. She remembered the bookstore cafe where they met, how he had looked up from 3 laptops and smiled as if he'd finally paused for air. That memory felt far away now, hidden beneath applause and flashing cameras. Dessert arrived, plated like small works of art. Conversation turned louder again, yet Shannon's silence grew deeper. A colleague approached her. "You must be proud," he said kindly. "He's unstoppable." She nodded politely. "He's dedicated." Her eyes drifted back to Edgardo. He laughed at a story someone told, relaxed and confident, unaware that his words had landed differently than he intended. Eventually, she stepped away from the table, walking toward the window. Rain blurred the city below, turning headlights into long streaks of light. Edgardo finally noticed her absence when someone asked where she had gone. "She's probably taking a call," he said, unconcerned. But across the room, Shannon stood alone, her reflection faint in the glass. "You okay?" a waitress asked gently while passing. "Yes," Shannon answered, though her voice sounded distant. "Just needed some air." The waitress smiled and moved on, leaving Shannon alone with her thoughts. Later that night, Edgardo would replay this moment in his mind more times than he expected. But 2 years later, he would walk back into a place he thought he'd outgrown, carrying words he hadn't yet learned how to say. For now, though, he stood surrounded by success, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding nearby. He finished a conversation and scanned the room, spotting Shannon by the window. With an easy stride, he made his way toward her. "There you are," he said, leaning beside her. "You disappeared." She turned, offering a small smile. "Just watching the rain." He followed her gaze. "You always liked storms." "They make people slow down," she replied softly. He chuckled. "I don't slow down, not tonight." Her eyes searched his face, as though waiting for something more, a question, a reassurance, but he only squeezed her hand briefly before being called back by another guest. "I'll be right back," he promised. She nodded, though something unspoken lingered between them. The celebration continued, laughter echoing against the glass walls while the city lights shimmered beyond. Moments like this are why stories matter, not just the victories, but the choices hidden inside them. If you've ever stood at a crossroads between ambition and connection, you already understand why this night mattered. Edgardo returned to the center of the room, raising another toast, thanking investors, employees, and friends. Applause followed him wherever he moved. Yet at the edge of the celebration, Shannon grew quieter. She watched him not with disappointment, but with realization, as if she had finally understood something he had been saying all along without truly hearing it before. When the evening finally began to wind down, guests collected their coats and exchanged last congratulations. The rain outside softened to a steady whisper. Shannon slipped out first, stepping under the glow of the streetlights. Cool air brushed her face, carrying the distant hum of traffic. Inside, Edgardo finished one last conversation before realizing she was gone. He checked his phone. No message. "Have you seen Shannon?" he asked a colleague. "She left a few minutes ago," came the reply. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door, confident she was just waiting outside like always. But as the glass doors closed behind him, he noticed something different. She stood a little farther away than usual, arms folded gently, watching the rain fall onto the pavement. For the first time that night, he felt a hint of uncertainty. "You disappeared," he said as he approached, voice lighter than the question in his eyes. She looked up at him, calm but distant. "You sounded very sure about what you want," she replied. He nodded without hesitation. "I am." A quiet pause settled between them, heavier than the rain. She gave a small smile, kind, controlled, and stepped slightly aside, leaving a small space between them that hadn't been there before. And in that subtle distance the first fracture began. Edgardo Winthizer woke before the city even considered opening its eyes. 5 a.m. The alarm chimed softly, never loud enough to startle him. He sat up immediately, no hesitation, no lingering under the covers. The skyline outside his penthouse window glowed faintly blue, clouds hanging low over Seattle as morning prepared itself quietly. He tied his running shoes with practiced precision and stepped outside. The streets were nearly empty, just a few early commuters and delivery trucks humming past. Edgardo ran with a steady rhythm, breath controlled, mind already listing the day ahead. Investor calls, product reviews, strategy meetings. For him, movement meant clarity. When he returned home, he opened his laptop before the coffee finished brewing. Emails flowed across the screen like a language he spoke better than conversation. Replies were short, direct, efficient. "Morning, boss," a message from his assistant read. "Schedule updated, big pitch moved up an hour." Edgardo typed back immediately. "Good, I'll adjust." No complaints, no hesitation. Freedom to him meant owning every minute, deciding where it went and why. By 8 o'clock, Hayes Dynamics buzzed with energy. Glass offices, bright screens, engineers discussing code over half-finished coffees. The company moved fast because its CEO did. Edgardo walked through the lobby with quiet confidence. Employees straightened slightly as he passed, not out of fear but respect. "Morning, Ed," called Marcus from the product team. "We finalized the interface update." Edgardo stopped just long enough to glance at the tablet Marcus handed him. His eyes moved quickly across the design. "Clean," he said. "Push it to testing today." Marcus nodded, energized by the approval. Inside the conference room, a group of investors waited. Charts illuminated the wall behind him as he spoke, calm, precise, every sentence measured. "Our growth isn't luck," he explained. "It's consistency. We choose what matters and ignore what slows us down." One investor leaned forward. "And your personal life? Ever worry about balance?" Edgardo smiled politely. "Balance is knowing what you're willing to sacrifice." A few people laughed, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. 2 years earlier, long before the dinner that would change everything, Edgardo had stepped into a small bookstore cafe near the waterfront. It wasn't his usual environment, too quiet, too slow, but a power outage at his office forced him to improvise. He sat at a corner table with 3 laptops open, cables stretching like roots across the surface. "Excuse me," he said to the barista. "What's the Wi-Fi password?" A voice from the next table answered instead. "You don't even know my name," the woman said lightly, sketchbook balanced on her knees. Edgardo glanced up. She had a pencil tucked behind one ear, dark hair falling across her cheek as she drew. Lines formed effortlessly under her hand, confident, alive. "I will," he replied, closing one laptop halfway. "What is it?" "Shannon," she said with a small smile, "and the password is written on that chalkboard you walked past." Laughed softly at himself. "Guess I was moving too fast." "That happens," she said, "especially when you bring your entire office into a cafe." He looked at her sketchbook. "What are you working on?" "People," she answered. "They're more interesting when they don't realize they're being watched." He raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "Only if you don't like honest portraits." That was the first time in weeks he closed his laptop completely. They started talking more often after that day. Coffee breaks turned into longer conversations, sometimes about art, sometimes about business, sometimes about nothing at all. Shannon didn't treat him like a celebrity CEO. She teased him when he checked his phone too often and laughed when he tried to explain algorithms in too much detail. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the cafe windows, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of running?" "I don't run away from things," he said. "I run toward goals." "And when you reach them?" He paused. "Then I set another one." She studied him for a moment, pencil resting against her lip. "That sounds lonely." "It's efficient," he corrected. She smiled, unconvinced but kind. Despite their differences, something between them felt easy. Not loud or dramatic, just steady. Their relationship unfolded slowly. Late walks by the water became a routine. Shannon talked about her dream of opening an art studio where adults could rediscover creativity without pressure. Edgardo listened more than he spoke during those moments, hands in his pockets as they watched boats drift across the harbor. "You know," she said one night, "you're quieter outside the office." "Work demands focus," he replied. "And what do you demand from yourself when you're not working?" He thought about it, surprised by the question. "Peace, maybe." She nudged him playfully. "You don't look peaceful when you check emails every 10 minutes. He laughed, a real laugh, rare and unguarded. With Shannon, he allowed small pauses in his constant motion. Dinners stretched longer. Conversations wandered without a clear agenda. She never pushed him to change. She simply created a space where he didn't feel like a headline. Still, there was one thing Edgardo never left unsaid. "I don't want to be tied down," he told her early in their relationship while they sat on a bench overlooking the water. Shannon nodded thoughtfully. "Tied down means different things to different people." "To me," he said, "it means losing control of my time." She considered his words, fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. "I'm not asking you to give up anything. Just to be honest about where you're going. I always am." And he believed that was enough. She believed love meant patience, so she stayed, accepting his boundaries while quietly hoping his perspective might evolve someday. While Edgardo's days filled with strategy meetings and expansion plans, Shannon's life moved at a softer rhythm. Her studio began as a small rented space with sunlight pouring through wide windows. Paintbrushes lined the shelves, and laughter often replaced silence as adults rediscovered the joy of creating something imperfect. One afternoon, Edgardo stopped by unexpectedly. A group of students greeted him with curious smiles. "This is the famous CEO," one joked. Shannon laughed. "He's just Edgardo here." He looked around at the colorful canvases, slightly out of place but intrigued. "It's different from my office." "That's the point," she said. "No pressure to perform." He watched as a student hesitated over a blank canvas. "Just start," Shannon encouraged gently. "There's no wrong way." Edgardo noticed how her voice softened when she taught. Patient, warm, steady. It was a side of life he rarely saw. Later, as they locked up the studio together, he said, "You make people feel safe." She shrugged. Everyone deserves a space where they're not measured by output. He didn't reply immediately. The idea lingered longer than he expected. Evenings together became a balance between their worlds. Some nights they cooked dinner, music playing softly in the background while Shannon described her students' progress. Other nights, Edgardo took calls from the balcony, voice low and focused, while she sketched nearby. "You work too much," she teased one night. "I work enough," he corrected, setting his phone down. She handed him a small drawing, two figures walking side by side, their hands barely touching. "That's us?" he asked. "Maybe," she said. He studied the sketch longer than expected, noticing the space between the figures, not distant, but cautious. At 32, Edgardo believed structure was the highest form of freedom. Morning runs, clean schedules, clear goals. He didn't see himself as cold or distant. To him, emotions were distractions that slowed progress. Love was something he valued, but only when it fit within the life he had carefully designed. During a late dinner one evening, Shannon asked quietly, "Do you ever think your definition of freedom might change?" He shook his head with certainty. "Freedom means choosing your path without pressure. And what if someone chooses to walk beside you?" she asked. He smiled gently, reaching for her hand. "Then they understand the rules." She squeezed his fingers, her expression soft but thoughtful. Outside, the city lights reflected in the window behind them, two lives moving together, yet guided by different visions of the future. Looking back, nothing seemed wrong during those months. They laughed easily. They supported each other's ambitions. Their worlds blended just enough to feel balanced. But beneath the quiet harmony, a question waited. Not urgent, not loud, just present. And when the celebration dinner arrived, with rain against the glass walls and a room full of people watching Edgardo's every word, that question would finally surface in a way neither of them could ignore. For now, though, he continued measuring life in minutes, convinced that control was the same as happiness, unaware that the very structure he relied on might one day leave an emptiness no achievement could fill. The kitchen smelled of garlic and fresh basil, soft music playing while rain tapped lightly against the windows. Shannon stood by the stove, stirring a pan with easy rhythm, while Edgardo leaned against the counter, scrolling through a message on his phone. "Is that work again?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Just a quick reply," he said, typing fast. "Investor question, I'll be done in a minute." She smiled faintly. "You always say that." He slipped the phone into his pocket and walked over, wrapping his arms gently around her waist from behind. "Okay," he murmured. "Done." She laughed quietly, nudging him aside so she could finish plating dinner. They moved around each other comfortably, familiar and warm. On the surface, nothing felt wrong. Two people sharing a home-cooked meal, talking about small moments from their day. "My sister had her baby this morning," Shannon said while setting plates on the table. "A little girl." Edgardo paused just slightly before sitting down. "That's great for her." "She sounds exhausted," Shannon added with a soft laugh. "But happy." He nodded, taking a bite of pasta. "I'm glad it worked out the way she wanted." The words were supportive, yet carefully neutral. Shannon noticed the pause more than the response. After dinner, Shannon opened her sketchbook at the table, charcoal smudging lightly across her fingers as she drew. Edgardo sat nearby with his laptop, reviewing slides for an upcoming presentation. The room felt calm, but their focus moved in different directions. "You know," she said without looking up, "one of my students told me today she hadn't painted since college. She said she felt like she lost a part of herself for years." "That's what happens when people stop setting goals," he replied absent-mindedly. "Or when they forget what makes them feel alive," she corrected gently. He glanced at her drawing, a pair of overlapping shapes, unfinished but expressive. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked. "Movement," she said. "Two paths crossing." He nodded, returning to his screen. Minutes passed in quiet companionship, yet something beneath the surface shifted, not conflict, just a growing awareness that they moved through the world differently. One evening, after a long week, they walked along the waterfront, cool air brushing against their faces. Boats rocked gently in the distance, and the sky faded into soft shades of gray and gold. Shannon slipped her hand into his. "You've been traveling a lot lately. Expansion phase," he said. "We're opening new partnerships." "I'm proud of you," she replied. "I just miss the slower days sometimes." He smiled. "Things will calm down eventually." She tilted her head. "Will they? Or will there always be another goal?" He considered the question, then shrugged lightly. "That's what keeps life interesting." She didn't argue, but her silence lingered longer than usual. They stopped near the railing, watching the water ripple. "My studio's growing," she said after a moment. "I'm thinking about adding weekend workshops." "That's amazing," he said sincerely. "You're building something real." She looked at him with warmth. "We both are, just in different ways." A few weeks later, they attended a small gathering at a friend's apartment. Music played softly and conversations drifted between travel stories and future plans. Someone asked Shannon about her studio. "It's becoming a place where people feel comfortable being imperfect," she explained. "And you, Edgardo?" another guest asked. "What's next for you?" He laughed lightly. "Growth. Always growth." "Any plans beyond work?" the guest teased. Shannon felt the question settle into the space between them. Edgardo answered without hesitation. I like my life the way it is. The conversation moved on quickly, but Shannon's smile faded just enough for him to notice, though he didn't understand why. Later, as they walked home, she said quietly, "Do you ever think about what beyond work could mean?" "I think about what's real," he replied, "and right now, building something lasting matters most." She nodded, though her steps slowed slightly. Another evening found them back in the kitchen, laughter filling the room as they attempted a new recipe that turned out messier than expected. Flour dusted the counter, and Shannon wiped a streak from his sleeve. "You look like someone who shouldn't be allowed near baking," she joked. He grinned. "I prefer spreadsheets." She studied him for a moment, then said softly, "I'm not asking you to change anything right now. I just want to know where we're going." He leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "We're going forward. Isn't that enough?" "For now," she whispered. The words hung gently between them, not an argument, just an unfinished thought. They finished cooking and sat down to eat, conversation returning to lighter topics, but the earlier question remained quietly present. One afternoon, Edgardo visited Shannon's studio again. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating colorful canvases and half-finished sketches. Students laughed as they experimented with bold brushstrokes. "You make this look effortless," he said while watching her guide a hesitant student. "It's not effortless," she replied. "It's patient." He folded his arms, observing the room. "You don't push them to be perfect, because growth happens when people feel safe enough to try." Her words lingered with him longer than expected. Later, as they locked the studio, she asked, "What does success feel like to you lately?" He paused. "Fast, busy, necessary, and happy." He hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "I'm satisfied," he answered finally. She smiled gently, though her eyes searched his face as if hoping for something deeper. Back at his penthouse that night, they sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. The hum of traffic drifted upward, steady and distant. Shannon rested her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I think we're walking at different speeds." He turned toward her. "Different doesn't mean wrong." "I know," she said. "I just don't want us to lose each other without noticing." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We're solid." She nodded, trusting his certainty even as a quiet question remained inside her. They stayed there until the air grew colder, watching the city glow beneath them, two people deeply connected, yet slowly drifting toward a conversation neither had fully begun. And somewhere between laughter, shared dinners, and unspoken hopes, the first real tension took root. Not loud or dramatic, just steady enough to change everything that came after. The road curled through pine-covered hills, mist clinging to the mountains as Edgardo guided the car along narrow turns. Shannon rested her head against the window, watching clouds drift low across the landscape. For once, neither of them checked their phones. "This was a good idea," she said quietly, breaking the soft hum of the engine. "Getting away." He nodded. "I needed a reset before next quarter starts." She smiled faintly at his choice of words. Even a peaceful weekend sounded like a business strategy when he described it. Cabins appeared in the distance, scattered along the edge of a quiet lake. The water reflected the pale sky, still and calm. Edgardo parked near a small wooden lodge. As they stepped out, the air felt cooler, lighter, untouched by the rush of the city. "No meetings," she teased. "No deadlines." He stretched his arms overhead. "Don't get used to it." She laughed, though something in his tone lingered, a reminder that this moment existed outside his usual rhythm. They spent the afternoon walking along the shoreline, wrapped in jackets while leaves shifted softly beneath their steps. Shannon pointed toward a cluster of birds gliding low over the water. "I used to come somewhere like this with my family," she said. "It always made me feel grounded." Edgardo watched her more than the scenery. Out here she moved differently, slower, lighter, fully present. "You seem happy here," he said. "I am," she replied. "It reminds me that life doesn't always have to move so fast." He skipped a stone across the lake, watching the ripples spread outward. "Speed isn't the enemy, losing direction is." She tilted her head. "And what happens when direction changes?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took her hand, leading her toward a bench overlooking the water. They sat side by side, shoulders brushing, the quiet between them comfortable yet thoughtful. That evening, they wrapped themselves in blankets on the cabin porch. The sun lowered slowly behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and gray. Shannon watched the horizon for a long moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, voice calm but steady. He turned toward her, sensing the shift in tone. "About what?" "Us," she said simply. He nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I love what we have," she said. But sometimes I feel like we're drifting without talking about where we're going." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "We're building something strong. Why rush to define it?" She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't feel like pressure. "Because someday, I want more than just drifting." His gaze moved to the lake, reflecting the fading light. "I told you from the beginning," he said gently. "I don't see myself changing my priorities." "I'm not asking you to change today," she replied. "I just want to understand if there's a future that grows, not just stay still." The air cooled as the sun slipped lower. Edgardo ran a hand through his hair, weighing his words carefully. "I see travel, growth, freedom, a life where we keep exploring without expectations hanging over us." She nodded slowly. "That sounds beautiful, but someday, I want a family. Not right now, just someday." The sentence settled between them like a quiet truth finally spoken aloud. His jaw tightened, not with anger but certainty. "That's not a path I want," he said. "I've always been clear about that." Shannon held his gaze, her eyes shining though her voice stayed calm. "I know. I just hope time might open different possibilities." Silence followed, filled only by the gentle movement of water against the shore. He reached for her hand, squeezing it softly. "I don't want to lose what we have." She smiled faintly. "Neither do I. But pretending we want the same future won't protect us." They walked down to the lake as the last light faded. The sky darkened slowly, stars beginning to appear above the mountains. Shannon slipped her arm through his, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. "I wish love could solve everything," she said quietly. "It solves a lot," he replied. "Just not everything." She nodded, accepting the honesty even though it hurt. They stood there for a long time, saying little, holding on to a moment that felt both peaceful and heavy. "I don't want us to become strangers who stayed too long," she added softly. He turned toward her. "What are you saying?" She took a steady breath. "Maybe we need space to figure out who we are without trying to change each other." The words weren't loud or dramatic, just gentle and final. The next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating half-packed bags near the door. They moved around each other with kindness, sharing coffee at the small kitchen table. "No anger," she said, meeting his eyes. "Just honesty." He nodded. "You deserve someone whose dreams match yours. And you deserve the freedom you've always worked for," she replied. They hugged for a long time, not tightly, just enough to acknowledge what they meant to each other. When they stepped outside, the lake looked unchanged, calm and still. He loaded the car while she watched the mountains one last time. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he answered, voice softer than usual. They drove back toward the city together, yet something between them had shifted, not broken in bitterness, but quietly reshaped by a truth neither could ignore. And as the road wound back toward Seattle, the space between their hands on the center console felt wider than it had ever been before. Back in Seattle, Edgardo returned to the rhythm that had always made sense to him. Morning runs came first, meetings followed, flights blurred into hotel rooms and conference halls, where his name appeared on glowing screens behind him. "Congratulations on the expansion," a journalist said after an interview. "You make it look effortless." He gave a polite smile. "It's just focus." Applause echoed through the room, cameras flashing as investors shook his hand. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way he had planned it: progress, recognition, growth. But when the applause faded and the doors closed behind him, the quiet felt heavier than before. His new penthouse overlooked the harbor, walls of glass stretching from floor to ceiling. At night, the city lights reflected across the water like scattered stars. He set his keys down on the counter and loosened his tie. Silence greeted him. No music playing from the kitchen, no sketches spread across the table, no soft voice asking how his day had gone. He ordered dinner through an app and opened his laptop while waiting. Emails filled the screen, numbers moving upward, opportunities multiplying. When the food arrived, he barely tasted it. Across the room, an empty chair faced him. A small detail he tried not to notice. Weeks passed quickly. Hayes Dynamics announced a major partnership, and Edgardo stood on stage presenting the future of the company with his usual confidence. "Our goal," he said, voice steady, "is to build something that lasts." The audience applauded, and he stepped down feeling the familiar rush of accomplishment. Later, during a celebratory dinner with his team, Marcus raised a glass. "You've built something incredible, Ed. Seriously." Edgardo nodded. "We all did." Laughter filled the table, yet he found himself glancing toward the empty seat beside him, a habit he hadn't fully shaken. "You okay?" Marcus asked quietly. Yeah, Edgardo replied, just tired. But exhaustion wasn't the only thing lingering behind his calm expression. One evening, while reorganizing a shelf in his apartment, a thin piece of paper slipped from between two books. He picked it up slowly. A charcoal drawing, two figures walking side by side, their hands barely touching. Shannon's style was unmistakable. He sat down on the couch, studying the sketch longer than he expected. The space between the figures felt intentional, almost symbolic. I got everything I wanted, he murmured to the empty room. The words didn't sound as convincing as they once had. He set the drawing on the coffee table but didn't move it away. Work filled most of his days, yet evenings stretched differently now. Instead of shared dinners, he scrolled through news articles or reviewed data late into the night. The glow of his laptop replaced conversation. One Friday, he stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Wind brushed against his face while traffic lights blinked below. He remembered Shannon's voice asking, "And when you reach your goals?" He had answered confidently back then. Now the question felt unfinished. His phone buzzed with a message from an investor congratulating him on another milestone. He replied quickly, slipping back into the familiar rhythm of productivity. Still, after setting the phone down, he stayed there longer than usual, watching the lights flicker across the water. Months passed, and success continued to build around him. Articles praised his leadership. Invitations to exclusive events arrived weekly. At one networking reception, a guest asked casually, "How do you balance everything?" Edgardo gave the answer he always used, "You choose what matters most." The words sounded confident, but something inside him shifted as soon as he said them. What mattered most? The question lingered as he drove home that night, city lights reflecting across the windshield. When he stepped into his apartment, the quiet greeted him again, familiar, steady, and just a little too loud. He walked past the coffee table, where Shannon's sketch still rested, untouched. One evening, rain returned to Seattle, tapping softly against the glass walls of his living room. Edgardo stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching droplets slide downward. The city felt alive outside, yet inside everything remained still. He remembered the celebration dinner, the laughter, the confidence in his voice when he spoke about freedom. Back then, he believed freedom meant avoiding anything that could slow him down. Now, standing alone in a room filled with success, he wondered why the silence felt heavier than achievement ever had. He picked up the sketch again, tracing the faint charcoal lines with his thumb. "I hope you're happy," he said quietly, unsure whether he meant her or himself. The rain continued falling, steady and calm. While the realization settled slowly, success had grown louder, but his world had grown quieter. And for the first time, Edgardo began to feel the space that ambition alone couldn't fill. Morning sunlight stretched across the wooden floors of Shannon's art studio, warming the rows of canvases lined neatly against the walls. Soft music played in the background, while a small group of adults gathered around a long table, brushes and paint scattered between cups of coffee. "Okay," she said gently, clapping her hands once. "Today isn't about perfection, just start somewhere." A woman near the window hesitated, staring at a blank canvas. "I haven't painted in years," the woman admitted. Shannon walked over, offering a reassuring smile. "That's the best place to begin." She demonstrated a simple brushstroke, slow and confident. Within minutes, laughter replaced uncertainty, colors spreading across the room like quiet bursts of courage. Teaching had become more than a job. It was a space where she rediscovered parts of herself she hadn't noticed slipping away before. After class, Shannon cleaned the brushes carefully, placing each one back into its holder. The studio felt peaceful when empty, not lonely, just still. Her phone buzzed with a message from a friend inviting her to a gallery opening that weekend. "You should come. Your work deserves to be seen." She smiled at the screen, typing back a simple yes. There was a time when she would have waited to check Edgardo's schedule before making plans. Now, she filled her calendar with things that felt meaningful to her. Exhibitions, workshops, quiet walks through neighborhoods she hadn't explored before. One evening, while rearranging paintings along the wall, she paused at a familiar sketch, two figures walking side by side. She studied it for a moment, then placed it gently in a drawer. Not hidden, just set aside. At the gallery opening, warm lights illuminated abstract pieces hanging from white walls. Shannon stood beside a small painting of her own, listening as strangers discussed colors and movement. "You're the artist?" a man asked, studying her work. She nodded, slightly shy but proud. "I am." "It feels honest," he said. That word stayed with her. Later, she sat with friends at a nearby cafe, laughter flowing easily between stories of travel and creative projects. "You seem different lately," her friend Maya said. Calmer. Shannon thought about it for a moment. I think I'm just listening to myself more. Does that mean you're done with relationships? Maya teased. She smiled softly. It means I'm not waiting for life to start. Weeks turned into months. The studio grew busier, filled with returning students who found comfort in Shannon's quiet encouragement. One afternoon, a student asked, Do you ever regret past choices? Shannon wiped paint from her hands before answering. I think every experience teaches us something, she said thoughtfully. Regret only stays when we stop growing. The class nodded, returning to their canvases. She didn't speak about Edgardo often, not because she avoided the memory, but because it no longer defined her days. The past felt like a chapter she had learned from rather than something she needed to revisit constantly. Outside, rain began to fall softly, tapping against the windows, a familiar Seattle rhythm that once reminded her of long walks with him. Now it simply felt like weather. One evening, after closing the studio, Shannon walked along the waterfront alone. The air carried the scent of salt and distant coffee shops preparing to close for the night. She leaned against the railing, watching boats drift across the dark water. Funny, she murmured to herself, how silence can feel peaceful instead of heavy. She thought about the woman she had been during her relationship, patient, hopeful, sometimes unsure of where she fit in someone else's world. Now she felt grounded in her own path. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a photo from her sister, the baby wrapped in a small blanket, smiling. Shannon smiled back at the image. Life keeps moving, she whispered. As her studio expanded, Shannon began planning weekend retreats for students who wanted to paint, outdoors. She researched locations, designed invitations, and hung a new sign near the entrance, Create Without Fear. One afternoon, while reviewing schedules, she paused and looked around the room. Sunlight glowing through the windows, paint drying on easels, laughter drifting from a corner where two students compared sketches. She felt proud not of success measured in numbers, but of a life shaped by intention. Her assistant approached. You've built something really special here. Shannon smiled. It's still growing, and so was she. Without rushing, without forcing anything, Shannon stepped fully into a version of herself that existed beyond any relationship, warm, strong, and quietly fulfilled. Unaware that somewhere else in the city, Edgardo stood at a window, holding an old sketch, beginning to realize that freedom without connection felt different than he once imagined. 2 years passed quietly, marked by achievements, exhibitions, flights, and new routines neither of them expected when they first said goodbye. On a gray afternoon, rain returned to Seattle, tapping steadily against sidewalks and storefront windows. Edgardo walked without checking his watch, hands tucked into his coat pockets as he moved through familiar streets. He wasn't heading to a meeting. He wasn't chasing a deadline. He stopped in front of a small bookstore cafe near the waterfront, a place he hadn't visited since everything changed. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he pushed the door open. The bell above the entrance chimed softly. Warm light filled the space, the scent of coffee wrapping around him like a memory. Shelves lined the walls, and quiet conversations blended with the hum of an espresso machine. He ordered a drink and turned toward the window. And there she was. Shannon sat at a corner table, sketchbook open, pencil moving slowly across the page. Her posture was relaxed, her expression calm, different, yet unmistakably her. She looked up at the same moment he noticed her. A small pause settled between them. Hi, Edgardo, she said gently. Hi, he replied, suddenly aware that his usual confidence felt quieter here. He approached her table slowly. Mind if I sit? Of course, she said, closing her sketchbook halfway. For a few seconds neither spoke. The rain outside softened into a steady rhythm against the glass. You look well, he said finally. So do you, she answered, studying his face with a calm curiosity. How's the studio? He asked. Busy, she said with a smile. In a good way. People keep surprising themselves. He nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm cup in front of him. The company's grown a lot too. New partnerships, bigger team. I saw an article about you, she said. You seemed different. He raised an eyebrow. Different how? Less rushed, she replied. He considered that for a moment. Maybe I learned that not everything has to happen at once. The conversation flowed easily after that. Travel stories, mutual friends, small memories that felt lighter with time. There was no tension, no attempt to revisit old arguments. Just two people meeting again without expectations. At one point, Shannon glanced toward the window where rain blurred the streetlights outside. You always like this weather, she said. I used to think it slowed things down too much, he admitted. Now I think it makes people notice things they'd usually ignore. She smiled softly at the change in perspective. He hesitated before speaking again. I thought freedom would feel louder, he said quietly. But sometimes it just feels quiet. She didn't rush to respond. Instead, she let the silence breathe for a moment before answering. Quiet isn't always a bad thing, she said. Sometimes it's where growth happens. He nodded, appreciating the simplicity of her words. A barista passed their table, refilling water glasses while music shifted to a slower melody. Outside, people hurried beneath umbrellas, unaware of the quiet reunion happening inside. Shannon opened her sketchbook again. Want to see what I was working on? He leaned closer as she turned the page. Abstract lines formed shapes that hinted at movement, two paths crossing gently without colliding. It's beautiful, he said honestly. It's unfinished, she replied. Some things are, he murmured. Their eyes met briefly, not with the weight of the past, but with an understanding that time had softened what once felt impossible. Eventually, Shannon glanced at the clock on the wall. I have a class starting soon, she said, gathering her things. Right, he replied, standing with her. It was good seeing you. It was, she agreed. They walked toward the door together, rain tapping lightly against the glass as she reached for her coat. Before leaving, she paused. Edgardo. Yeah, I'm glad you came back here. He smiled faintly. So am I. She stepped outside, disappearing into the soft rain while he remained inside for a moment longer, watching the door close behind her. The cafe felt warmer than when he arrived, filled with something he hadn't realized he missed. Ease. And as he sat back down at the table where they had just talked, he understood that the past didn't have to stay frozen where they left it. Sometimes returning to a familiar place wasn't about reliving old memories. It was about seeing who you had become since then. A week after the bookstore reunion, Edgardo stood outside Shannon's studio holding a small paper bag from a nearby cafe. The evening light stretched across the sidewalk, soft and unhurried. She opened the door with a surprised smile. You actually showed up early. I'm learning, he said lightly, raising the bag. Peace offering, almond pastries. She laughed, stepping aside to let him in. The studio smelled faintly of paint and fresh coffee. Canvases leaned against the walls, and a few students packed up their supplies as class ended. Everyone, this is Edgardo, she said casually. Just Edgardo, he added, shaking a few hands. The atmosphere felt easy, without the pressure of defining anything. They walked to a small restaurant nearby once the studio closed, choosing a quiet table near the window. So, she said, unfolding her napkin, how does a CEO spend a free evening these days? Apparently, he replied, smiling, waiting for someone to finish teaching art classes. She tilted her head, amused. That sounds new. It is. Dinner stretched longer than either expected. They talked about small things, a travel mishap she laughed about, a project he admitted had taken more patience than skill. The conversation flowed naturally, without the heavy weight of past disagreements. At one point, Shannon asked gently, Are you still running at sunrise every day? Most days, he said, but sometimes I skip it if I want to watch the city wake up instead. That sounds like progress, she teased. He met her gaze. You changed too, she nodded thoughtfully. I stopped waiting for clarity to arrive. I just started living. There was no need to define what they were becoming again. The evening felt grounded in presence rather than promises. Dinners turned into a quiet routine. Some weeks they met at her studio after class, sharing takeout while sitting on the floor surrounded by unfinished paintings. Other times they walked along the waterfront, talking about everything from music to childhood memories. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in soft colors, Edgardo said, I used to think freedom meant avoiding responsibility. She glanced at him, curious. And now? Now I think it means choosing what actually matters, he replied. She squeezed his hand gently. That sounds like someone who's grown. He smiled, not arguing. When Shannon hosted her first large gallery opening, Edgardo arrived early, standing quietly near the entrance as guests admired her work. You don't have to stay the whole night, she whispered when she noticed him. I want to, he said simply. He moved through the crowd without drawing attention, congratulating her students and listening more than he spoke. At one point, a visitor asked him, Are you the sponsor? He shook his head. Just someone who believes in her work. Shannon overheard the exchange and felt warmth spread through her chest, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he was present in a way she hadn't seen before. Later that night, after the last guest left, she leaned against the wall beside him. Thank you for being here, she said. I'm proud of you, he replied quietly. Even at Hayes Dynamics, people began noticing subtle differences in Edgardo. During a company meeting, he paused before starting the presentation. We move fast, he told his team. But speed isn't everything. Sometimes progress means stepping back and asking why we started in the first place. Marcus raised an eyebrow afterward. You've changed, man. Less intense. Edgardo laughed softly. Maybe I'm just listening more. He left the office earlier that evening than usual, ignoring a few non-urgent emails so he could meet Shannon for dinner. One evening they sat on a park bench overlooking the water, sharing coffee while the city lights flickered on one by one. Are you afraid we'll fall into old patterns? She asked gently. He thought about it before answering. I think we're different people now. That changes everything. She nodded, watching a boat glide slowly across the harbor. I don't need perfection, she said. Just honesty. You'll always have that, he replied. There was no dramatic declaration, just a calm understanding that this version of their relationship felt steadier, built on growth rather than expectation. Weeks passed and their connection deepened quietly. Edgardo began leaving work early once a week, turning off notifications as they cooked dinner together. Shannon noticed how he listened more, how he stayed present instead of drifting toward his phone. You're really here, she said one night, handing him a glass of wine. I didn't realize how often I wasn't, he admitted. They stood by the window watching rain fall gently across the city, shoulders touching, comfortable in the silence. This time, their love didn't feel like something fragile waiting to break. It felt steady, built slowly, intentionally, and without rushing toward a future neither of them needed to define too soon. And as their dinners turned into shared routines filled with laughter and honest conversations, the space between ambition and connection began to feel less like a choice, and more like something they were learning to balance together. The rain returned the night Edgardo made the reservation. Not heavy, just a steady rhythm against the city streets as he stood outside the glass-walled restaurant where everything once changed. The skyline shimmered beyond the windows, reflections dancing across polished floors inside. This time there were no investors waiting, no cameras, no speeches, just a quiet table set near the window. Shannon arrived a few minutes later, brushing raindrops from her coat. She paused when she recognized the place, eyes widening slightly. You chose here, she asked, a soft smile forming. I thought it felt right, he replied. If that's okay. She nodded. It is. They sat down, the atmosphere calm and intimate, completely different from the crowded celebration years earlier. Dinner moved slowly, filled with gentle laughter and small memories. Do you remember how loud it was last time? She said, glancing around. He smiled faintly. I remember thinking I had everything figured out. And now? She asked. Now I'm less interested in being certain, he admitted. She studied him for a moment, warmth in her eyes. That sounds peaceful. Outside, rain traced soft lines down the glass, city lights glowing behind them. He reached for his water glass, turning it slowly between his hands. I've thought a lot about what freedom meant to me back then. And what does it mean now? She asked gently. He met her gaze, choosing the people and moments that actually make life feel real. She didn't respond immediately, just listened. As dessert arrived, Edgardo's expression grew more thoughtful. I wasn't fair to you before, he said quietly. I knew what you wanted, and I stayed in a space where I didn't have to grow. I thought control was the same as strength. Shannon shook her head softly. We were both learning. I don't see that time as wasted. He nodded, grateful for the grace in her words. I don't expect anything tonight, he continued. I just want to be honest about who I am now. Her smile softened. Then be honest. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small ring box gently on the table between them. No dramatic gestures, no crowd watching, just quiet sincerity. This isn't pressure, he said calmly. It's a choice I'm ready for, but only if it feels right for you too. Shannon's eyes moved from the box to his face, searching for the certainty she once doubted. What changed? She asked softly. He took a breath. I stopped seeing love as something that takes freedom away. I realized it's something you choose again and again. The ring catching the warm light from above. Silence settled around them, not heavy but full of meaning. Tears gathered in her eyes, though her smile remained steady. I don't need perfection, she whispered. I just need truth. You have it, he replied. She closed the box gently, stood up, and wrapped her arms around him. Yes, she said, her voice soft but certain. For a moment everything else faded. The rain, the city noise, the past versions of themselves who once sat in the same place unsure of the future. They didn't announce the engagement loudly, no champagne toast, no attention drawn to their table. Instead, they sat back down and finished dessert, laughing quietly about how different this night felt from the last time they were there. "You know," Shannon said, "this place doesn't feel heavy anymore." "It feels honest," he replied. Outside, the rain softened into a light drizzle, the skyline glowing as if reflecting the calm between them. And for the first time, Edgardo didn't feel like he was choosing between ambition and connection. He felt like he was finally building a life where both could exist, not as competing forces, but as parts of the same future. Morning light filled their new home slowly, slipping through wide windows and warming the quiet kitchen. Shannon stood at the counter pouring coffee while Edgardo adjusted the blinds, watching the city wake up below them. "Still waking up early?" she teased. "Some habits stay," he said, smiling. "But now I don't rush out the door." She handed him a mug. Their fingers brushed briefly, a small, familiar gesture that felt natural rather than dramatic. The apartment didn't feel silent the way his old penthouse once had. Soft music played in the background, and sketches rested beside his neatly stacked work folders on the table. Two worlds learning to exist side by side. At Hayes Dynamics, Edgardo's leadership shifted in ways even he didn't fully notice at first. During a team meeting, he paused mid-presentation. "We've always chased growth," he said, looking around the room. "But growth isn't just speed. It's making sure we still recognize ourselves along the way." Marcus leaned back in his chair, smiling. "You're starting to sound philosophical." Edgardo laughed quietly. "Maybe I'm just learning to listen." He ended the meeting early that day, something the old version of him would never have done, and headed across town to Shannon's studio opening. When he arrived, she stood near the entrance greeting guests, eyes lighting up when she saw him. "You made it," she said. "I said I would," he replied. He didn't stand at the center of attention. Instead, he watched proudly from the background, letting her world shine without trying to shape it. Evenings became a mix of creative projects and quiet conversations. One night, Shannon spread sketches across the dining table while Edgardo reviewed a presentation nearby. "Do you ever miss how simple things used to feel?" she asked. He considered the question. "I think things are clearer now, not simpler, just more real." She nodded, continuing to draw. They didn't rush toward big declarations or dramatic changes. Instead, they built routines that felt steady, cooking together, walking through the city, sharing long talks about dreams that no longer felt like opposing forces. One morning, rain returned again, tapping softly against the glass while the skyline glowed beneath a pale sunrise. Edgardo stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the light shift across the buildings. "What are you thinking about?" Shannon asked, stepping beside him. He smiled. "That the thing I once feared most turned out to be the greatest form of freedom." She leaned gently against his shoulder. "Maybe freedom isn't about escaping life," she said. "Maybe it's about choosing it fully." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle quietly inside him. The city moved below them, busy, loud, alive, but the space they shared felt calm and grounded. Their life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still busy weeks, unexpected challenges, and moments when they had to remind each other to slow down. But the difference was honesty. When Edgardo felt overwhelmed, he said it instead of hiding behind work. When Shannon felt uncertain, she spoke openly instead of waiting in silence. They supported each other's growth without trying to reshape who the other person was. One evening, while arranging photos along a shelf, Shannon paused at an old sketch, two figures walking side by side. She handed it to him. "Do you remember this?" He smiled softly. "We used to stand a little farther apart." She leaned into him. "Not anymore." Some choices feel powerful in the moment, but reveal their meaning only with time. Edgardo once believed freedom meant standing alone, guided only by ambition. Shannon believed connection required patience and honesty. Together they learned that growth doesn't erase the past, it reshapes it. Success without connection had felt incomplete. Connection without honesty had once felt fragile. But when they allowed themselves to evolve, the life they built became stronger than either of them imagined at the beginning. And as the rain faded into sunlight outside their window, Edgardo realized something simple yet profound. Freedom had never been about avoiding responsibility. It had always been about choosing the life and the person worth building it with. Some choices don't reveal their meaning right away. Sometimes it takes distance, time, and a little silence before we understand what truly mattered all along. Edgardo once believed freedom meant standing alone, moving fast, staying in control, never letting anything slow him down. Shannon believed that growth came from honesty, patience, and the courage to keep building even after things fall apart. Their journey wasn't about perfection. It was about learning that success feels different when someone walks beside you by choice, not obligation. Maybe you faced a moment where ambition pulled one way and connection pulled another. Maybe you've had to decide what freedom really means in your own life. If this story made you think, I'd love to hear your perspective. Was Edgardo wrong back then, or was he simply not ready yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments and join the conversation. And if you enjoy meaningful storytelling like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, take care of your growth, stay honest with yourself, and remember that sometimes the strongest endings are just quiet beginnings waiting to be noticed.